today was day 2 of the impeachment proceedings. The Senate was filled with all of the senators, and all of the Democratic impeachment House managers were there giving their pitch for why Donald Trump should be convicted. We're going to go through some quotes. We're going to look at a clip, I think, from Joe Negussi, who we talked about yesterday. And what I want to do to start this off is to just give you the quick Cliff Notes version of my thoughts on the day. Now, to be fair, I did not listen to everything intently, right? I was not sitting there in front of the TV screen watching all of this. I would have jumped out of the window. But what happened was I was sort of tuning in and out, reading a lot of the synopsis from Washington Post, New York Times. They just had this sort of running catalog of what was taking place, and then I was reading and watching some of the actual proceedings in real time. I have some screenshots. I have some images, some 3D renderings that they were showing today. So we're going to get into it, but I want to give you the Cliff Notes version. I want to talk about what I thought was good today and what was bad today. So let's frame this out a little bit more. Yesterday, they were talking about jurisdiction. What constitutionally was allowed? Was it allowed for them to actually even hear this trial? That was the conversation yesterday. And we didn't talk a lot about jurisdiction yesterday. We talked a lot about the harm to the Capitol building and how egregious it was. We heard it from Senator Raskin, or from House Member Raskin and others. And we kind of talked a little bit about jurisdiction, but largely it was sort of most of the same stuff that we heard today. The Senate voted that this was constitutional. And so today, the Democrats have had basically the full day to go out there and give their opening argument, to make their case, called a case in chief. They wanted to present what they thought were their most compelling points, and they did that. And I have some good things to say about it. Now, I don't think that it's going to change anything. I think that this whole thing is kind of a foregone conclusion. I think that they can put on the case of the century, and there's just still not enough political willpower for the Senate to convict Trump, sort of regardless of how bad or incompetent Trump's attorneys are. Or maybe they come back after yesterday's little bit of a stumble and they present a very compelling response. We don't know yet, right? We're open to seeing what they come back with. But here is what I thought the Democrats did very good today. Number one, very persuasive. I thought that they were very, very persuasive. Now, it was highly emotional, which is a good thing if you are a prosecutor. If you're somebody who's bringing the charges, I'm a criminal defense attorney, so I'm usually on the other side of, I'm always on the other side of this. But prosecutors, largely, they have the more emotionally compelling arguments. They just do, right? Because they have somebody that they can blame, they can pin the fault on somebody. It's typically the defendant. In this case, it's Donald Trump. They can say, look what a monster he was. And they can make a lot of sort of frothy emotional appeals. They can show images of the Capitol building being stormed and videos of people falling down and, smoke flying around and all sorts of really gruesome imagery. They can talk about that stuff. Donald Trump, by contrast, he doesn't really get to talk about any of that stuff. I mean, he can sort of try to downplay it by showing the Democrats making similar statements, but he's at a disadvantage because he doesn't have a version of the Capitol Hill riots that he can show and say, look what Nancy Pelosi did, look what Chuck Schumer did. And it's harder for him to connect them to some of the summer unrest. And so just from a purely persuasive posture, they have a more compelling emotional argument. This happens all the time. Prosecutors do this. He could have killed somebody. He was driving drunk, and little girls were in there. There's a park nearby, and oh my God, little Susie could have been walking across the street. And so what Trump can come back with is say, well, yeah, but the Constitution says this, and due process says this, and the legal definition of incitement is that, and the Brandenburg test, and so on. And it's just boring and bland. I think it's more relevant for a legal proceeding, but this is not really a legal proceeding. This is sort of a political spectacle. And so the Democrats are playing to their advantage. They have some very good persuasion going on here. Very emotional day. Every time I tuned in, every one of them looked like they just got punched in the face. Oh God, this is so draining. It's so hard. Life's so difficult. This is so serious. And they're doing a good job of that, right? And I think some of it's probably very genuine. Some of it is probably a little bit fictitious because they're putting on a show. This is their big debut. We saw yesterday, I think, going back to 2017, House member Raskin has been calling for impeachment for like 3-4 years now. He's just been screaming about it for a long period of time. So this was his big debut, and they're doing a good job of exploiting the rules, of exploiting the political spectacle. They're making it very, very emotional and very persuasive. They're also very repetitive, to sort of tie off on that. They had a theme we're going to talk about, and they used a 3-part theme sort of called a triad. And Joe Negussi talked about this early in the morning. I'm going to show you what that looks like. And they were extremely repetitive, very, very repetitive. All day, we just saw images of the Capitol and just inside, outside, just damage, a lot of statements. We saw social media posts. We saw tweets from Donald Trump from other websites that we're going to talk about today. And it was just a barrage, very, very repetitive, which is a good technique. If you want to, succeed in court, one of the first things they'll teach you to do is to set a theme and then beat the hell out of the theme. Hit it, because the jury is going to get lost in a lot of the noise. If you go in there and you start talking about, well, Article 1, Section 3, it says this, and you transfer over to, well, Article 2, Section 2, and you kind of, crisscross that, even though that might be legally more relevant, it will make most people's eyes glaze over. And so the Democrats know that. They're not doing that. They're talking about this theme. They're talking about it in emotional terms. They're being very repetitive about it. They also talked a little bit today about causation. This was my big gripe yesterday. We were talking about sort of the prospective flow chart, and I'm going to show you that again here today, the same one that we were experimenting with yesterday. They're kind of following that, actually. Yesterday, if you don't remember, if you missed that show, I said if I was a prosecutor, this is how I would kind of lay it out. Just shooting from the hip. There's no real right way or wrong way to do it. And they're kind of following that along. They were progressing through that today. And they did talk about causation. Yesterday, not so much. Yesterday, it was Donald Trump said some bad things and the Capitol building had a meltdown. And they were really kind of disconnecting the two. They didn't do a good job of showing how one connected to the other. But today, they did talk about that. And they actually used some legalese, some legal language that is sort of ringing the bells for a lot of attorneys that makes us recognize causation. They're talking about causation. And then lastly, I thought what was very good from them, and this is going to be difficult, I think, for the Trump team to match, is they were very energetic. They had a good pace. They had dynamic speakers. All of them were pretty good. I think that from one to the next, they kept their presentation short and concise enough so that you didn't lose, you kind of didn't drift off. And they had a big variety of speakers. They had, I think I clipped 5 or 6 just for the show, but they had even more than that. And so you had a good pace. It was constantly changing. It wasn't like what we saw yesterday with Quinn Castro, one of Trump's attorneys, where they basically just had him go for 45 minutes. And about 10 minutes in, everybody was on Twitter going, what the hell is he talking about? Anybody know? Because, okay, let's give it another 10 minutes. Okay, have we learned anything? Another 10 minutes, and it went for 45 minutes, and everybody's just going, what the heck is he talking about? And so the Democrats didn't do that. They kept it interesting. I think that a lot of people, probably Americans, were probably engaged in it, and it was, I think, effective. So we're going to give those props to the Democrats on that. Now, the bad part of this, and a lot of this, I think you can sort of pin on the Democrats. Some of it is just, I would say, the nature of a political show trial like we're witnessing here today is, well, they didn't have any witnesses. All right. And Jonathan Turley made this point. There was no ability for cross-examination. So now we're getting back into the weeds, right? The Democrats are talking about, American democracy is failing thanks to Donald Trump. And then we come back here and we go, yeah, but I mean, you were sort of talking about hearsay evidence. You really didn't bring any witnesses in. All of your statements were from media people who were writing articles in the days immediately following the aftermath of the Capitol Hill riot. So we know that it was all hyperbole. Nobody really had their facts straight. There was statement after statement that the officer who was killed, was murdered. And now we're learning, well, they can't really prove that case. I just saw a news article that Brian Sicknick, the officer there, forgive me if I mistook his last name, but there's an indication here that they can't prove a murder charge against him. Prosecutors U.S. attorneys have special assignment and all this stuff. And so a lot of the language was about murder and just the destruction of America immediately thereafter, but that kind of hasn't really fleshed itself out. And so they were still using a lot of those old reports that were very damning, very vitriolic, and you're not able as a defendant, as somebody on the other side, to cross-examine any of that, right? In a regular court of criminal law, none of that stuff would ever come into court. You would just say, okay, that's all external sources, it's all hearsay. If you have somebody who was a witness to it and you want to bring them into court, yeah, you can ask them questions and they can testify about what they saw there, but we get to cross-examine them. We get to say, wasn't it true that you said this and you were really here and this actually didn't happen? And we have another corroborating witness who actually refutes your claim. And you could just, you could cross-examine him. That's what's called due process. That's how a regular trial would work. We had none of that today. It was just like a big presentation, video after video, graphic after graphic, post screenshots all day long. And so it was like, it's like you went to a seminar or something and you're just watching slides going one after the other. It wasn't a real court proceeding where you would have an objection. You could say, Judge, we've already heard this argument. Objection, we've already seen that. Objection, we stipulate to all of this. This is becoming more prejudicial than it is probative. Is this doing more harm than good? It's not actually getting to the facts. It's distorting the facts. And so we saw a lot of that today, basically all day. We also saw that this repetitiveness, this theme was, as I sort of just mentioned, it was overly prejudicial in my opinion. They just kept going on and on and on and on, that there was damage at the Capitol, that people were injured, that this whole thing was scary and traumatic. We know, we got it. In a regular court of law, you would have been able to just object to that and say, Judge, we agree with that, right? We already understand that. And one of Trump's attorneys yesterday made that same point. We'll stipulate to that. We'll agree that the Capitol Hill riot happened and that it was damaging, and we don't need to see all of the different angles from where they came, the west side, the north side, the south side, this stair, that stair, internal security cameras flying around. We got it. We know. That's not the question here. The question is, was this incitement from the president? And that really wasn't answered all that well, in my opinion, today. This was all a lot of, he said a ton of bad stuff, so we're going to bundle that up into a little bow tie package, and we're just going to connect it with all the damage that we saw there, but we're still missing the causation. I didn't see much of that. They also failed, in my opinion, to distinguish what is a political speech. So they went through a lot of Trump's speech, and they not just the speech, but all of his statements from the preceding months, and they sort of tried to lump that into one bucket and then make the claim that you can presume incitement. You can presume that if you bundle all of those comments together, that you can suddenly infer that he intended for the Capitol Hill riots to take place in the way that he did. And that's just fallacious. You can't do that. That's not something that you can draw an inference from, unless there's something more, which I didn't see them prove. And then lastly, I think something else that was pretty bad, and we're seeing this just on and on and on, is the scope was very, very expansive, right? It included almost everything that they could think of, and the presentation was not particularly relevant to the question at issue. And so, in my opinion, the question really here that we would want to be asking for a government official is, did a government official intentionally cause the interference of the functioning of government in a way that would amount to what I would believe would be a higher standard of an incitement of an insurrection, not just random political bluster, bloviating speech, and then something bad happens, because that standard is so low that any politician, in my opinion, could be impeached for that, which is why we've been joking about it and drafting up documents called impeachment party documents for Kamala Harris, Chuck Schumer, and I could go on and on and on and make the same arguments at length for the foreseeable future, probably for every single person in Congress, according to the Democratic standard. We're going to review what their standard was, but it got even more expansive. So now it's basically everything. They were talking about quotes from the Donald.win, from people posting on different websites saying, well, I'm going to go down to D.C., and they're saying, see, Trump caused that. His statement caused that. And so now you're going, wait a minute. So anybody who says anything, they're responsible for how people on the other end of that receiving communication, how they receive it, what they do. Every single thing that I say, if somebody does something as a result of what I said, I'm responsible for that across the entirety of my life. That's a ridiculous standard. It doesn't make any sense. And I understand why they were doing it, because they're allowed to here, because this isn't a regular court proceeding. They're allowed to just kind of play hard, or play loose with the rules. They can talk about this stuff. They can expand the scope, because there are no Republicans in there saying, objection, that's outside the scope. Objection, that's not relevant. Objection, that doesn't answer anything. It's not a pertinent issue here. That didn't take place today. Instead, it was just one big presentation. And so there are a lot of due process problems with that, procedural problems with that. Those are very boring problems, right? The American people probably just would listen to me go, yeah, but, that's hearsay, and that's hearsay on hearsay, and so on. And then you go, all right, but what, so what? What's your point? Okay, they're talking about a dead police officer and tear gas in our nation's capital. You're talking about rules of evidence over here? Okay, which one has more of a persuasive argument? Now, I know, where I would fall on that question, but I think a lot of people would fall on the other side, and the Democrats know that, and they exploited that very effectively today. So I hope Donald Trump and his team are prepared. All right, so let's dive into the news. I wanted to start by just doing a quick recap on yesterday. We went through a little bit of a flow chart. I want to show you that, but before I do, I want to flag over from the Washington Post a couple kind of buzzwords that stood out to me today. And so here, this was posted this afternoon. It looks like at 2:31 p.m. over on the Washington Post. There was a rolling series of updates that they had over there. As the Senate impeachment trial of former President Trump resumed, House managers argued that the attack on the Capitol was predictable. All right, see that there? We didn't hear that yesterday, and it was foreseeable. Ooh, those are causation words, because of the president's provocations. So he was provoking them, including tweets, speeches that were displayed as part of their presentation. The managers planned to show previously unseen security footage from January 6th. They warned the parents and teachers some of it will be graphically violent. All right, so yesterday what I was talking about is causation. And so we went through a flow chart just to give you a quick recap on it. I was saying if I was prosecuting this, if I was the Democratic Party saying we're going to go and convict Trump, and I wanted to do this in a legal format, then this is sort of what it would look like, right? We would say that first and foremost, the court has jurisdiction, which the Senate approved yesterday. And then you would need to go and say, all right, what he said on that particular day amounts legally to incitement. You would have to overcome the Brandenburg test, which is the defense to incitement. And I think that practically, I think Trump fails. I mean, their case, I think, would fail right here if you were in a real court of law, but we're not. So they can sort of, kind of navigate around that. Then they're going to have to show that he incited something. What was that incitement? It was insurrection, right? We got the insurrection. He did something that caused something else. He didn't incite a riot. He didn't incite shoplifting. He didn't incite murder. He incited an insurrection, which was the interference of the government. And the Trump defense would be, well, that's political speech, right? You're allowed to do that. And that's his First Amendment objection. A little bit different than incitement. It's a First Amendment objection, which his team raised in his memo. And then we sort of have to prove this causation stuff, right? Causation means, okay, so if he did all of that stuff, if he actually did incite the insurrection, we have to prove through causation that he caused an actual interference with the government. And yesterday we talked a lot about this. A lot of people are saying that the harm, the damage to the Capitol building is evidence of the insurrection. And it's close. I mean, it's related, but not really, right? You could have an insurrection without any damage to the Capitol building. You don't have to have dead people or a burnt down building or smoke or broken windows in order to have an insurrection. It's more likely that you would, but you could have an insurrection very peacefully. Okay, we kind of saw that going on, I think, in Myanmar, right? They just kind of rolled up and took over things, right? I didn't see much explosions or damage or warfare going on. It was just, they just kind of stepped in there. They took over the country. Same type of thing could happen here. Didn't necessarily, but the key point is interference. That's what the harm was. They were interfering with the government operating and counting the electoral votes. And so the question is, did Donald Trump, through his incitement language, cause an insurrection that led to that interference? And so yesterday we didn't see much causation. We just saw people jumping from the fact that he said something that resembles incitement. They were saying, well, the incitement led to, they kind of skipped over everything, to harm, which was the problems that we saw at the Capitol Hill riots, right? We saw all that damage. And so they kind of just jumped over here. We spent a lot of time in this harm box, but we didn't really focus on interference. Well, now we're talking about foreseeability. Okay, we're talking about predictable, whether it was predictable and foreseeable, and that goes into causation. So they're saying here at this point in time, when he was talking about incitement and insurrection, he either knew or should have known that all of this type of behavior was going to meet causation. It was going to cause the interference. So this is the type of language. They're saying it's predictable, right? He should have known. Anybody would have known that if he was talking that way, it was going to lead to the interference of the government. That's a tall order, right? Literal interference, not just damage. We saw a lot of damage all throughout the summers. It's interference with the operation of government. They're saying it's foreseeable, and this is legal. This is legalese, right? This is legal words, and we're talking about. What would a reasonable person foresee? Would a reasonable person who's giving that speech foresee that they would storm the building and interfere with the Electoral College? the counting of the electoral votes. Democrats are saying absolutely it was foreseeable. Trump is saying, or we'll see what his defense attorneys would say, but I think he's going to say no, right? It's not. And this, like I said, this is sort of following the same format that we were talking about. So they're trying to prove causation today, and Trump's response will say, nope, there were intervening causes. There were superseding causes. There were other reasons why this all took place. Not from the speech, not from the couple months of sort of fretting about the election integrity. All of that was relevant, but it didn't cause the storming of the Capitol. And so now we're talking about foreseeability. Would a reasonable person think that would happen or not? That's up for debate, right? And so they're moving the ball forward. I think they're talking about causation a little bit. The other thing that they're talking about is they're expanding the scope pretty dramatically. This was the scope we talked about previously. In the original article of impeachment, they combined all of this stuff into one document. They said he made repeated false statements, and they were unhappy with these two statements that Trump made in the Save America rally speech. We won by a landslide. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. They were also unhappy about the Raffensperger phone call, which we are going to talk about. That was the call where he was in the settlement agreement with Brad Raffensperger over the votes. Scope was very limited. Other things in the original article of impeachment were outside the scope, meaning that it wasn't relevant. Things like the non-Save America rally stuff, anything Donald Trump Jr. said, Giuliani, Sidney Powell, tweets, Linwood, statement of the rioters, other websites, all of that stuff was not in the original article. But then they shoved it all in there. So they crammed it all into the new scope by drafting their memorandum, which is including everything. And then today, now we saw even more stuff was included in there. They went over to the Donald.win, and they were taking statements from self posts over there, and they're just cramming everything in, and they're doing it effectively. They're trying to establish a pattern, right? And they're just using a shotgun approach. We're going to pick every single bad statement that Donald Trump ever said. We're going to take every single bad post that any random person on the internet put out there, and we're going to consolidate it into this hour-long presentation. We're just going to beat it into the ground one after another. And there's nobody to push back on that, right? In a regular court of law, you'd say that is not even pertinent to anything that we're talking about. Okay, what some random person said on Twitter or on Reddit or any other one of these websites is not relevant. What did Donald Trump do? What did his actions do to cause the incitement with the interference, the insurrection of the government on January 6th? What somebody posted a month ago is not particularly relevant to that. I'm saying a month prior to January 6th, right? And they just kept expanding the scope. There were no defense attorneys. There's no rules or procedures there where they can squeeze that scope back down and say and object to any of this stuff. So basically everything got in. All right, so let's get into today. This is what Representative Raskin was talking about at the early part of the day. We're going to show graphic videos of violence, and we saw this just all day long. He says we're going to be showing relevant clips of the mob attack on police officers and other innocent people. We urge parents and teachers to exercise close review of what young people are watching here and watch along with them. We're going to try to give warnings, and they did that, right? They went through, and we saw a lot of it. And their presentation I thought was pretty well done. You can see here's a screenshot from later in the day. This was not right after Raskin. I kind of jumped way ahead. So they were going through, they got some nice 3D graphics. They were sort of walking us through, where people were coming from, where they were going, just madness, bedlam everywhere. Then they were, citing their sources. So they got ProPublica over here. Then they had the video playing in the background, warning, explicit video, right? And so it looked good. They had some nice graphics. It was well done, well put together. And it was a little bit more organized than what we saw yesterday with Trump's, unfortunately, bumbling attorney. And they also did a nice job establishing a theme from early on. And Joe Neguse here goes through it. We have a clip of him. He's establishing 3 different things that they're going to hammer all day long, one after the other. And he details them, right? The 3 things. And this is something that they actually teach you. I learned about this in my trial practice class in law school. And they say, hey, 3 things. Okay, don't go outside of that. It's too many. 2's not enough. 4's too many. So stick it to 3, right? And you sort of use that everywhere in life. We talk about it here at our firm. What do we provide? Safety, clarity, hope. What are my 3 values? Authenticity, integrity, and service. Those are my personal values, right? And so you can use that triad elsewhere in your life. It's sort of a nice cadence, a nice rhythm, and people can follow along. It's just kind of a natural thing that happens. If you say 2 things, people are looking for a third. If you say 4, people are wondering if there's more coming or what the deal is. 3 is just nice and round, and it's symmetrical. So let's take a look at what Joe is doing here using that triad strategy.
It will become clear exactly where that mob came from. Because here's the thing, President Trump's words, as you'll see, on January 6th, in that speech, just like the mob's actions, were carefully chosen. Those words had a very specific meaning to that crowd. And how do we know this?
Put a pin in that one.
Because in the weeks prior to, during, and after the election, he used the same words over and over and over again. You will hear over and over 3 things. You can see them on the screens. First, what lead manager Raskin referred to as the big lie, that the election was stolen, full of fraud, rigged. You will hear over and over him using that lie to urge his supporters to never concede and stop the steal. And finally, you will hear the call to arms, that it was his supporters' patriotic duty to fight like hell. To do what? To stop the steal, to stop the election from being stolen by showing up in this very chamber, to stop you, to stop us. I'd respectfully ask that you remember those 3 phrases as you consider the evidence today.
Yeah, so clever. I think pretty clever. I think pretty effective. Here's what he was trying to do. So first and foremost, I have a big problem with the fact that he's sort of taking this and saying, we can just infer what Donald Trump was intending to do, what he was intending to say. Sort of like what Trump was saying in the months preceding the Capitol Hill riots. Anything was sort of coded language. It was a secret dog whistle. He was saying these phrases like, you know, the big lie, stop the steal, and all of those things. Like those were code words that he was just broadcasting out there, and the rest of America, you know, all of the MAGA militia people that the sort of on trial here were just responding to that. They're just sort of stood up and said, oh, that I know what that means. That means we got to storm the Capitol and take over the government, right? You're just sort of mind reading and presuming that you can make that connection. You can infer that from Trump's statements. Very, very dangerous, folks. I mean, that is a standard that I think is troubling. If you can just, once again, if you can just sort of blame anything that somebody does on an inference of something that somebody else said, because they said it a lot or because you disagree with it. I mean, it's a bizarre standard. If I said anything in the world, somebody did something bad as a result of it, and they can just connect that back and they can say, well, that was kind of a code word, right? He said that a lot and somebody else took action on that. I'm now liable and responsible for that. You can't even have a conversation about what the actual words mean because you can just manipulate them. They don't mean what they mean. They mean what we think they mean. Joe Negussi says, well, he said stop the steal. And so those are fighting words. When he gave the order, fight like hell, that was the trigger. That was the code word. Go attack the building. And you're going, well, that's not what he said, though. I mean, his real words didn't say to go attack the building. He said the word fight, I think 23 times, or in the transcript, it was 23 times. Large part of that was from the crowd, you know, fight for Trump, fight for Trump. And he, in the other context, he didn't say it in that way. And the word fight, you know, we got to look at the words and say, what do the words mean? He's just sort of taking what he said and extrapolating the definition to fit the narrative that he's trying to craft, which I think is a little bit disingenuous, not a good standard. I don't think that he would appreciate if that same standard were applied to him, right? If somebody listened to a speech that he gave and did something bad as a result of it and said, well, I mean, to me, the person who did the bad thing, I did something bad and I was listening to Joe and I kind of thought that that's what he meant. Would we hold Joe Negussi liable for that? Of course not, right? Because it's not about it's not the person who took the act, who did the bad thing, they're responsible for that. You saying something is not, okay, unless it meets the definition of incitement, which again, they have not proven yet. And they're not even attempting to prove that. They're just moving forward and saying, following his 3 threshold criteria. So he goes through and he says, one, he's doing a good job of laying a premise. So saying this whole thing was based in a lie. Then he goes through and he talks about the steal. And then he says, once he uttered that phrase, fight like hell or you're not going to have a country anymore, that was the code word. That was the trigger. And so they just kind of layered on each one of those bullet points for the rest of the proceeding. And a lot of it was very dramatic. This was a post over from this woman here. She's not a representative. She's a delegate, Stacey Plaskett. She made the case that Donald Trump deliberately pushed his supporters to violently attack the Capitol, arguing he had encouraged it for months. Okay, which is such a massive claim. Okay, he deliberately pushed his supporters to violently attack the Capitol, saying he encouraged it for months. I didn't hear that. Okay, yes, he did say stop the steal. Yes, he had a lot of questions about the election integrity, filing lawsuits. Rudy was flying around the country saying this was a theft, this was being stolen, all of those things. But did he encourage them to violently attack the Capitol? And he deliberately pushed them to violently attack the Capitol. That's a big claim, and I didn't see any evidence of that. Now they're just sort of making a logical extension where one doesn't exist. I understand why they're trying to do it, but they're missing a stepping stone there. They're trying to go from his complaints about the election to the Capitol building riots, and they're not making a good connection there. She says Trump incited the violent mob to storm our Capitol when he ran out of nonviolent means to stop the election. Once assembled, that mob at the president's direction erupted in the bloodiest attack on the Capitol since 1814. Through tweets and social media posts and video clips, Plaskett showed the insurgents believed that they were doing the duty of their president. They were following his orders. So it's about how they interpreted it. It's not about what Donald Trump intended or what he said specifically. It's about how they interpreted it, which is a very dangerous standard. You could just find anybody who did anything wrong and just say who convinced you to do that. All right, well, go arrest that person. It's a scary standard, and they're running with it hard. And she said today, so she referenced over a post from the Donald.win. Okay, so this guy posted this, I don't know, 17 hours ago, whenever that was. I can't tell the date on that. The Donald.win, he said, today I told my kids goodbye. Today I had the very difficult conversation with my children. Daddy might not come home from D.C. As a veteran, this is always something you're prepared to discuss, but it never comes easy. All right, so they're just going around and they're just picking up random posts from random people out there on the internet, and they're attributing that to Trump. They're saying his rhetoric about the election was problematic and it caused all of this, without making a clear connection on that. And this is another point. If you're upset with how an election was run in this country, what are you supposed to do? Are you not supposed to talk about it? If you're an elected official and you think that there was a problem with the election, what are you supposed to say? I can't even bring that up because that might undermine American democracy, because I might be responsible for inciting an insurrection. Maybe you think that there was a legitimate problem in this country with how elections are run. Shouldn't you be able to speak up and be vocal about that? And wouldn't you want to do it passionately? And if you think you've got some evidence about it, wouldn't you want to be out there at the forefront of the conversation and being very aggressive with it? I would hope that our country would allow that to happen, right? If we can't even have a legitimate conversation about how our operations are being run in this country, how our elections are run, how our government is run, if we're now condemning and criticizing people for speaking out against the government. John Brennan, I'm still hot about it, said that libertarians, because they're anti-government, are sort of akin to other extremists around this country. Wait a minute. That's the whole point of being an American. You have a right to petition your government for a redress of grievances. It's in the First Amendment. Trump was doing that. You may disagree with how he was doing it. You may say it was reckless. It was too vitriolic. It was much too highly charged. I would agree with you on a lot of that. Okay, I'm not condoning a lot of his language, but it is still not criminal. It's still not impeachable. He's allowed to talk about his concerns with the election. It's part of being an American. And if they want to silence politicians from complaining about the government, they might as well just silence the rest of America. I mean, we're all complaining about the government regularly. If you have issues with an election, you got to be able to talk about it. They're saying he can't talk about it. He should have just sat down and shut up. That's not okay. Our next House manager was up. His name is Quinn Castro, one of the impeachment managers. He said that He detailed Trump's efforts to dismiss Biden win as rigged. He says the goal of the former president was to incite his base. That was his goal, to make sure that his supporters were angry, like the election was being ripped away from them. So he was intending to do that. This is clearly a man who refuses to accept the possibility or the reality in our democracy of losing an election. He said that it was rigged if Biden won. Now, all of us in this room have run for election, and it's no fun to lose. I'm a Texas Democrat. We've lost a few elections over the years. But can you imagine telling your supporters that the only way you could possibly lose is if an American election was rigged and stolen from you? But that's exactly what Trump did. His words became their actions. Very dangerous. Very dangerous. And yeah, like I said, if you were a politician and you think you lost an election, I would expect illegitimately, right? If you believe that there was legitimate fraud in an election, you have a right to contest that. I would encourage you to contest that. It's the only way that we can shore up our electoral system. Okay, it's the same concept that you see in criminal law or any law. You've got two sides opposing one another. You've got a prosecutor and a defendant, and the way that we keep our justice system supposedly intact and righteous is by having both sides constantly go to battle with one another. Prosecutors, they defend their cops to the end of the earth. Defense attorneys say your cops are crooked and corrupt, and we hash it out. And the facts get sorted out, and we are constantly, as defense attorneys, in my opinion, we are constantly challenging the government to make sure that they're following the rules, they're following the Constitution, they're not stepping all over our clients' rights. That's the same thing that should happen everywhere else in this country, right? You have adverse people coming together, and in the heat, in the conflict there, you have a synthesis. You come to a resolution that makes the system stronger. It makes the system better. We want that with our election system. I would love to see both candidates duke it out every time. Let's explain this stuff in a court of law. You think it was fraudulent? Boom, let's go. Let's hear the evidence. You present your evidence. Let's go get it. Stop dismissing this stuff on latches and mootness and all of that. And by the way, we have a lot of Democrats also talking about electoral problems. We saw this with Mark Elias, who was filing suit on behalf of a Democrat who I think eventually conceded out there in the northeastern part of the country. And they were saying, oh, the machines didn't count right. Okay. They litigated it, got resolved as far as I can tell. The lawsuits might still be pending, but it's an okay thing to do. If you legitimately thought you lost and you thought it was fraudulently done, of course you got to complain about that. So, Joe Quinn, I think that that's a pretty obvious thing. And if you lost and you thought that it was illegitimate, I would expect you to voice your concerns as well. Next up, we got Representative Dean. This attack would have not happened but for Donald Trump. Okay, this is another causation statement. Would never have happened but for Donald Trump. Okay, so literally without the president, and I think this is a good argument, actually. I mean, if Donald Trump didn't exist, that's a good argument, right? But what she's trying to say here is that the building would not have been stormed if Donald Trump had not taken some action. And so I don't really know what she's talking about. You know, largely the scope has been expanded to go all the way back to every statement that he's ever made. But in terms of causation, I think that's a really hard case to make. Okay, we now have evidence that they were storming the Capitol before he was done speaking. So did his speech cause them to storm the Capitol, or was it his other speeches in the months preceding the Capitol Hill riots? Because there's now evidence that there was pre-planning, they were moving in a coordinated fashion, there was conversations, the FBI was warning about it, everybody was on high alert about this thing. So when exactly did Donald Trump incite them? They're trying to take every single statement and lump it up into this cumulative theme and say that that was incitement. I just think it's too much. Okay, you have a right to say things in this country. You have a right to object to the election. You have a right to free speech. You can voice your displeasure. You can have a lot of disagreements. That's one of the beauties of this country. You're allowed to get political. You're allowed to get a little bit volatile, peaceful volatility. It's political conversation. All right, next up, we've got Ted Lieu. Ted Lieu, one of the House impeachment managers, said that he ran out of nonviolent options. That's the second time we've heard that, right? Nonviolent options to maintain power. And they were showing this as sort of this just constant failure of the Trump administration. Efforts in the courts threatening officials failed. He turned to privately and publicly attacking members in his own party. He would publicly bait the senators, naming them on social media. Said he took credit for Republicans' election victories. He was giving a specific warning to anyone who wouldn't help him overturn the results. Anyone who was against the president became an enemy. Let me be very clear. The president wasn't just coming for one or two people or Democrats like me. He was coming for you, Republican senators. He was coming for all of us, just as the mob did at his direction. Right? It's compelling. If you're a senator there and you have sort of a weak understanding of how this due process stuff works, it's a compelling argument. He was coming for you. You might have been in there if you're a Republican senator. You might be scared. But did his speech cause that? Did he intend his speech to cause that? Well, you can be the judge. McConnell might think so. Mitch McConnell might think so. So he was saying here that he's signaling, this came over from Bloomberg, Mitch McConnell is signaling to fellow Republicans that the final vote on the impeachment is a matter of conscience. Senators who disputed the constitutionality of the trial could still vote to convict the former president, according to 3 people familiar with his thinking. Kentucky Republican also suggested he hasn't made up his mind on how he'll vote, 2 of the people said. Even though he voted on Tuesday to declare it unconstitutional, the Senate will hear a case differently today. And let's see here. He says the position is starkly different than McConnell's declaration at the start of Trump's first impeachment trial last year that he did not consider himself an impartial juror. Yeah, and so you're going to see a lot more, I think, of that type of language, specifically that, you know, the original constitutional argument that we were having yesterday about whether or not the Senate had jurisdiction, that's done and over. So now that we've confirmed the Senate does have jurisdiction, now we shouldn't even be talking about those issues anymore. Now it's just the merits of the case. Can't talk about, the Chief Justice not presiding. Can't talk about not being able to present witnesses. Can't talk about the snap impeachment, how quickly it was processed through the House. All of that stuff is now moot. Senate agrees. Constitutional. So now the senators are supposed to just be impartial. They're only supposed to just listen to the facts that are in front of them, not consider any of the jurisdictional stuff. So even though McConnell voted against this being constitutional, theoretically, he should just set that aside, not worry about those issues anymore, and just make a judgment based on what's presented here today. We'll see if that happens. Now, as I mentioned, one of my things that I thought was bad was this part here, right? No witnesses, no cross-examination, all hearsay, and a lot of stuff that wasn't particularly relevant. And so, again, today was just a repetition after repetition about the harm, the damage, the chaos, the madness, the injuries, the insult, how awful the experience was for everybody who was involved, which I'm not disagreeing with. I completely agree, and I've been consistent about that. I thought what happened was horrible and horrendous, and I'm not excusing it. I just don't think it's criminal on behalf of Trump. Every single one of those people who was there, yeah, they were engaged in criminality. They're being prosecuted, by the way. They're all being investigated, and they're all being prosecuted. We've covered several of them on the show. Even people who were not a part of it are being prosecuted. People who showed up the next day, 2 of them we covered, are being prosecuted. They weren't even in the Capitol building. Okay, everybody's being prosecuted. So what are we talking about here today? We're talking about whether Donald Trump was responsible for that or not. And a lot of what we saw, I thought, was not particularly relevant, and it was hearsay evidence and no opportunity for cross-examination. And Jonathan Turley chimed in and supports that argument. He said, Raskin did precisely what I discussed in this column, inciting the news story just before the trial. The House did nothing for weeks to lock in such testimony in hearings, but is now citing witnesses from media reports. Right? Where were the witnesses? They could have brought them in. They could have gotten their statements. They're just referring to what CNN says because it serves them better. The House could have called dozens of witnesses to lock in their testimony on what Trump said and did during this period. Why? It seems to prefer to try the case largely on circumstantial evidence and media accounts of what these witnesses have said. The managers are again quoting aides from statements in the media, the very witnesses that the House has declined to call for testimony for the last 4 weeks. Why? Yeah, why? Because it's not about that. If you bring a witness in, then you have somebody you can actually talk about. You can actually cross-examine that person. You can ask them questions. If you just are reporting on what CNN reported, well, it's just a CNN report. What are you going to do? Go argue with the CNN reporter on that in the middle of a Senate impeachment trial? No, because they're not a witness. It's just an external, hearsay argument. It's somebody said something to somebody else that made it on a website in a blog post on Jeff Bezos's blog on Washington Post. It just goes on and on and on. And there's no due process here. There's no ability to confront your accuser or even to flesh out the evidence. Right? If somebody has a statement about something that happened, wouldn't it be good to know to just dive in and drill in to make sure that they know what they're talking about and they really saw what they saw? That's the whole point of having a judicial system, which this, of course, is not. So, overall, honestly, a pretty effective day for the Democrats. If they keep this up, I think it's good for them. It's not going to change anything. The Republicans are still going to vote to acquit him, and he's not going to be convicted unless something dramatic changes, right? Unless something changes, which it could. It's not 2020 anymore, but 2021 has not been any. It's not been much better. So it is I'm open to the possibility that something could get off keister here, but I just really doubt it. So we'll see where it goes. We're going to continue to cover it. It's probably going to be more of the same tomorrow. And then I think Friday, Saturday, we're going to have the Trump people come back. I hope right now that they're figuring it out. I hope they're putting together a PowerPoint slide at least. Come up with something, folks, because what we saw yesterday is not going to serve you well. I honestly think that they could probably just sit on their hands for the next 16 hours and he probably still would be acquitted just because the political willpower is not there. And if they really think that if this was a crime, why are they not charging him with a crime? Charge him. Let's see. I know why, because they wouldn't win the case. So they have to go through an impeachment proceeding. All right, so that's it for the impeachment stuff.